First time I've been able to say that in plural. We have both the British ambassadors here, which will give you some indication of the significance, but also the excitement that we have in this occasion. In the British School of Rome, when it draws close to the end of a calendar year, always likes to think of the community which it has worked with over the preceding months. We've been extraordinarily fortunate in this year to work closely with both embassies, with many of the foreign academies, and I can see several represented here this evening, with a whole range of individuals, countries, interest groups in this remarkable city. And it's been a pleasure for us to do so, and it's a pleasure for us to try to find a way to give something back. So our final event of the year tends to be something which we like to be a little bit special. So we cast around in our minds for who might be the right person to draw to a close a year which has seen many events, political, some scandals, some wars, some tragedies, and some farces, and which looks, at least at one point in the year, as if it might be the year that preceded two dynasties fighting it out in another country, in America, and we thought of somebody who knew the British School of Rome, and we also were struck by a Twitter tag. Now, I didn't know much about Twitter, but one of my colleagues, Sophie Hay, is an aficionado. So I looked and we found this: historian, Herodotus translator, dinosaur lover, hedgehog conservator, a leading English cricketer. Who better to invite to the British School of Rome, a home of historians, where Herodotus has been known to be read, which is, you could argue, full of dinosaurs. We have been known to be extremely kind to hedgehogs, and we're always a friend to good cricketers, of whatever country they may come from, even our Antipodean friends. Tom Holland is the owner of that Twitter tag, an author who has blazed several different trails in his scholarly and his popular career, from his time at Cambridge, where he took his first in English and in Latin. He has concentrated in part on the classical world, with a series of really important historical works: Persian Fire, Rubicon, and The Shadow of the Sword, Millennium, and now here, as we see, Dynasty, the rise and fall of the House of Caesar. It has not only worked on the classical world, it's also made a significant contribution to the way that we might approach or understand the Islamic world and the interactions between the Islamic world and the pagan or Christian world in the middle of the first millennium AD. And that's a critically important work. And although Tom Holland has obviously a huge following, writes books that are picked up and enjoyed by many, many people, there's deeply core level of serious scholarship, a profound understanding of the sources, and a real commitment to accuracy, which drives through the beautiful narratives which he is able to construct. And that's so important, because if one is going to do history well, one should be able to communicate history, but one should also be able to communicate good history. And that is one of Tom Holland's great strengths. We have him here, not, as I say, for the first time. He's returning to the British School of Rome after having researched in part Rubicon here. And so it's a real pleasure to have you back, to bring to a sort of, well, I hope only a temporary close, because we all wait for the following instalments, but bring to close one part of your relationship with the British School of Rome to commence another. Here we are with this sober cover, which will lead into a slightly less sober title, Whores and the House of Caesar. Tom Holland.
Thank you very much for that very, very kind introduction. Yes, a sober cover and a sober title. But really, there is no better city to come and give a talk about whores, because of course Rome is famously the whore of Babylon, almost certainly. And the portrait that St. John in the book of Revelation gives is, among many other things, a thrilling and unsettling portrait of how the imperial metropolis looked from the provinces to someone who did not really enjoy the spectacle of Rome's imperial sway. The whore of Babylon, riding on the beast, has a golden cup in her hand full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And it's fitting that the emperor, almost certainly who is uppermost when that splendid sentence was being written, was Nero. The month of the beast, almost certainly a play on Nero's name. We seem to have a description within the account of the various heads of the beast of Nero's own death, his throat being slit. But, and that's a crucial explanation, I think, for why the names of people like Nero, characters from the Julio-Claudian period, the period I'm going to talk about tonight, have a resonance and a potency that survived 2 millennia. And we're not just talking about Nero, although I think that his starring role in Christian demonology explains why he particularly perhaps has this kind of rock and roll status. But we're also talking about his mother, Agrippina, who, according to Roman gossip mongers, was not above indulging a bit of incestuous titillation whenever Nero was misbehaving, which God knows was quite often. There is, of course, Tiberius, who supposedly retired to the island of Capri and employed nubile young boys to do unspeakable things to his private parts. And then, of course, we have someone who is certainly as familiar to pornographers as to classicists. And because I'm coming to Italy, I've chosen the Italian film poster. Definite shades of bunga there. But all of this raises an obvious problem. Very kindly said, this is an issue of accuracy. And of course, looking at images like that, the question that is immediately made by anyone who has to write a history of this period, trying to make sense, is to what extent is it actually true? And the fact that the stories, the revolting stories often, that are told about these emperors and the great women at their court, the fact that they might be problematic in terms of actual fact has been recognised right from the beginning of people writing about them. So Tacitus, the greatest historian to write about the Julio-Claudian period in the annals, the very opening of it, he puts his hand in, he says, the histories of Tiberius and Caligula, of Claudius and Nero, were falsified while they remained alive out of dread, and then after their deaths were composed under the influence of still festering hatreds. Now, the problem has not been made any easier since Tacitus wrote those words. Because, of course, not only do we stand at a 2,000-year remove from the events that he was describing, but we've also had additional layers of varnish. And the perspective on these emperors is one that has become almost global. So this is no longer merely a topic that is suited for Rome. It is certainly a topic that is of great interest in, for instance, an out-of-the-way rainy province such as Britannia. So, if we look at how the British have interpreted this, this is from I, Claudius, the BBC adaptation of Robert Graves' novel. a look of the pure 1970s Britain. This is Scylla, who is the head of the Union of Prostitutes in Rome. And she has been challenged by Messalina, who is the wife of the Emperor Claudius, to what I suppose can best be described as a bonker. The challenge from Messalina to this leading prostitute is to see who can sleep with the most men continuously, and the one who sort of says, I'm too tired, I don't want to smoke, loses. In the BBC series, the dialogue is very, very much not Roman. Scylla is introduced to Messalina and says rather witheringly, the difference between this great lady Messalina and myself is that my work is her hobby. My hobby happens to be gardening. And she says this in a Penelope Keith accent. And of course, there's a sort of further 70s quality to the fact that she is the head of the Union of Prostitutes, as though she's about to go on strike during the winter of discontent. Because in Claudius the God, the Robert Graves novel, which inspires this passage, she is actually the head of the Prostitutes Guild. So again, you can see the way in which, in popular culture, these stories about the emperors are reworked and reworked and reworked. And Graves in turn was drawing on this tradition of decadence. This is Aubrey Beardsley, for whom Messalina was absolutely the archetype of kind of predatory nymphomania. I mean, this is a frankly terrifying image, particularly, not least because Michael Jackson seems obvious with And Beardsley in turn is drawing it really from two classical sources, this story about Messalina working as a prostitute. One is Pliny the Elder, the kind of Wikipedia of ancient Rome. In Book 10 of his enormous encyclopedia, he devotes entirely to the topic of reproduction. And when he comes to human reproduction, he kicks it off in a way that I imagine probably didn't go down very well with Mrs. Pliny, by saying that man is the only animal whose first experience of copulation is immediately followed by regret. He moves directly on to talk about this episode with Messalina, describes it as the most noble contest, says it goes on for 24 hours before finally Messalina wins, and Messalina is crowned as the ultimate. But the person who I think really skewers Messalina and has ensured that she's had this monstrous reputation ever since is Juvenal, famously misogynist, and in his satire on women, Messalina has a starring role. Juvenal describes her lying in bed next to the twitching, dribbling Claudius, and when he's asleep, she slips out of her bed, steals through the Palatine, heads off down to the very reddest of Rome's red light districts, where she gilds her nipples, puts on a blonde wig, and gets to work in one of the lowest, cheapest, dirtiest brothels in Rome. And it's that idea of the most powerful blue-blood woman in the great capital working in the lowest conceivable trade that I think has always been incredibly titillating, particularly to men, obviously, ever since. So what's going on? Where does this story come from? Is it possibly true? Well, there are a number of problems in trying to answer that question. It is, of course, the nature of courts that things happen behind closed doors. And the Romans themselves absolutely understood this. They appreciated that at the heart of the dynasty founded by Augustus, there was a kind of darkness that mocked and frustrated their efforts to penetrate it. They knew that once, before the coming to power of Augustus, before the establishment of an autocracy, back when affairs had been public, res publica, when the Republic had existed, that then things had been done in a way that enabled people to track how power operated in the state. That great men would speak to the people, and that as a consequence of those speeches, wars would be fought and policy would be drafted and changed. But they understood as well that the coming to power of Augustus, that had changed. And it was summed up in the 3rd century AD by Cassius, a great historian of the reign of Augustus, whose account is the only continuous account that we have. And he says that from then on, things began to be done secretly and in such a way as not to be made public. No one could see behind the front put up by Augustus. And those of you who went to the exhibition on Augustus that was here, I think, a couple of years ago, will recognise that this is a highly illegal photo. My younger daughter was with me. I had to get it. I made her go and cry and sat in the corner and said, "The guard, go and confidence." All in the cause of ancient history. Now, there was a further complication. It wasn't just that it was difficult to penetrate the world of the imperial court. There was also the fact that the Romans adored gossip. We had a mention of Twitter. They would have loved Twitter. They would have loved the chance to go online and bitch about people and stab them in the back. Because it wasn't just poets like Juvenal who would make catty comments about people or abuse them. There is, we're in the hall built by Andrew Moyes-Hadrill. There is a famous line of graffiti on the Basilica in Pompeii that essentially says, "Wall, I'm amazed that you haven't collapsed under the sheer weight of all the graffiti that has been scrawled on you." And that reflects the reality that in Pompeii, but even more in Rome, there was almost no stretch of public space where people wouldn't deface with abusive comments. And even if you were illiterate, you could still make your mark. If you were a great man and you put up a statue, you had to live with the knowledge that if you annoyed people, they would think nothing of going and urinating on your statue or squatting down and having a dump on it. You might go and look, full of pride, and see that it's sort of streaked with golden streaks or covered with turds. And if that was the case, then you would know. You would know that people had been talking behind your back. And in this context, I think that something that I found very enlightening in trying to sort of understand this was something that happened early this autumn when the story, to use the story in inverted commas, broke about what the British Prime Minister had been getting up to, supposedly, when he was at Oxford, involving a pig's head, I can say no more. Almost certainly not true. But it got extraordinary legs. People repeated it, people enjoyed it hugely. And in part, of course, that was because it was adding to the gaiety of the nation. But I think it also, even though people knew it wasn't true, it corresponded sufficiently to what people thought might have been true, that it gave it currency. And I think that is an example of how gossip works in the political sphere that is very useful to bear in mind when looking back at these shockingly more baroque stories that are told about the Julio-Claudians. These stories were believed because they were felt to be believable. And what that clearly reveals in the context of Messalina and other great women like her at the imperial court is very clearly, I think, a remarkable strain of misogyny. Because although Messalina is the most notorious great lady to have supposedly hawked herself as a prostitute, she's certainly not the only one. In fact, looking at the roster of the great women of the Julio-Claudian family, what is astonishing is that almost all of them, if they weren't accused of prostitution, were accused of adultery. Many of them were accused of both. In fact, it's hard to think of anyone really who didn't get this chance thrown at them, with one notable exception, who's very much the exception that proves the rule. This, of course, is Livia. Livia was, of course, the wife of Augustus. Now, she was the second. Augustus was her second husband. She had previously been married to Claudian. She was herself of Claudian descent, so she was incredibly blue-blooded. She had two sons, Tiberius and Drusus. Was indeed pregnant with Drusus, her second son, when the future Augustus started eyeing her up. And that was really the one shocking scandal that attached to her name. But once she had married, and once she was installed as the wife of Augustus, from that point on, she lived a life of irreproachable rectitude. She was never seen in public without the stola, the great heavy robe which marked the chastity and dignity of a Roman matron over her head. And as a result, when Augustus died, she reaped extraordinary rewards. She was given the name Augusta. So she was essentially, the implication of that word was that she was midway between the gods and the mortal. She was given male privileges, again unheard of. She was allowed lictors and bodyguards, she was given a priesthood, and when she died, she was, in the reign of Claudius, she was elevated up into the pantheon of gods, as Augustus, of course, had previously been. But the gossips did not leave Livia alone. Everyone who's watched or read I Claudius will remember that Graves makes Livia's ambitions for Tiberius the motor of the plot. She is determined to clear a path for her son to succeed Augustus, and with that aim she poisons or ruins everyone who stands in his way. And although Graves exaggerates this enormously for his own dramatic purposes, these traditions were current back in the 1st century AD. It was an absolute trope among the Romans that any stepmother would want to poison her stepchildren. So the best that can be said of Livia, she wasn't accused of prostitution, but she was accused of being a poisoner. Which kind of again focuses this question: what is going on? Were they really all monsters of utter depravity? Well, I think in trying to answer that question, it is significant to point out that the fact that they were regarded as monsters of depravity was bad for them. The Romans did have an understanding that depravity was something to be condemned, because as a consequence, the kind of film pieces of Caligula, there is a kind of sense, I think, maybe among the general public, that the Romans of this period were hopelessly debauched and depraved, and there was absolutely nothing to stop them. But the fact that these stories were told proves the opposite. The Romans were actually very shockable. They were in many ways a very moral, even puritanical people. And the reason that we know about the crimes, the orgies, the accusations of incest, and prostitution, is precisely because the moralists who are writing about them are doing so to condemn them. It mattered to seem moral. And in particular, it mattered particularly to Augustus, who, as the founder of the dynasty, is really sets the tone for everything that follows. Augustus was very, very concerned to seem moral. And he seemed moral, he was very successful at that. The word Augustan to this day means golden age. The sense of him as a Prince of Peace remains very strong. Now, the reality, of course, was that he was an absolute bastard. There's no getting away from that. He would not have got to the position of power otherwise. He seizes power. He embarks on an attempt to fulfill his ambition to seize control of the Roman state, absolutely monstrous ambition in the context of a state that had always regarded the autocracy of a single political figure with revulsion. He embarks on it at a very young age. He is born Octavius, he is the great nephew of Julius Caesar. He is adopted by Julius Caesar, becomes his son. And so, although he is often called by historians Octavian, meaning someone who was called Octavius who's been adopted, that was not the name that he used himself. He called himself Caesar. He was the young Caesar. That was the potency of his name. As Mark Antony, the lieutenant of Julius Caesar, who obviously was less than thrilled at having this young man turn up and gate crash the party, told him, he said, young man, your name is your fortune. Consul at the point of a sword, and ganging up with Mark Antony, to launch a series of murderous conscriptions that enabled him to raise yet more private armies from the proceeds of the loot stripped from the people that they had killed, to march off, to wipe out the armies of the assassins of Julius Caesar, and then to divide the world in two, and then ultimately, of course, to turn on Antony and to make himself the supreme ruler of Rome and of the empire with it. Ruthlessly politically, ruthless as well on a personal level. There are terrifying stories told of him that he had enormous quantities of captured senators of Italian cities that rebelled against him, slaughtered on the Ides of March, presumably as a kind of sacrificial offering. Another story that a would-be assassin was brought into his presence, that he put his hands around the side of the assassin's head, put thumbs over his eyes, and gouged the eyes out. And yet, he did promote himself very successfully as the man who brought order, peace, and stability to a world ravaged by civil war. And it was true. Now, the order that he brought was essentially that of a mafia boss who had shot up a town, wiped everyone else out, and then taken the credit for bringing peace and order. But that peace and order was enough for the Roman people to welcome his rule. And having done that, the reason that Augustus was able to portray himself convincingly as someone concerned for the morals of his fellow citizens is actually because he believed it. Augustus was a radical in terms of his ambition, but in almost everything else he was very conservative, particularly in his morals. And he believed, absolutely devoutly, I have no doubt, that the reason that the Roman state had been ravaged by civil war and faced by almost fatal implosion was because the gods had been neglected, and so he made a point of restoring temples, cleaning them, rebuilding what had been brick in terms of marble, the subject of his famous boast. But also he believed that Rome had been punished by the gods because of their sexual immorality. And so Augustus unprecedentedly sought to legislate against sexual immorality, in other words, to poke his nose right into the bedroom. And in 18 BC, for the first time, adultery was criminalised. And the penalty for it was very strict. It fell particularly on women, as moral legislation so often tends to do. A woman caught committing adultery was sentenced to be exiled to an island, to have to wear the dress of a whore, and to be ranked with the very lowest class of people in Rome. So not just prostitutes, not just madams, but the absolute, shockingly lowest of the low, actresses. Doesn't get any worse than that. Now, Nemesis caught up with Augustus famously in 2 BC, the very year in which he was hailed as the father of his country. His actual daughter was embroiled in a sex scandal to end all sex scandals. She was accused not just of adultery, but like Messalina, of prostitution, open prostitution in the forum, selling herself beneath the rostra from which her father had been wont to address the Roman people. And obviously, when a scandal as explosive as that hits a city like Rome, people sit up and take notice. So there is an element of schadenfreude in the response, the fact that Augustus is seen to have been hoisted by his own petard. But there are attempts to try and understand what was going on here. There was a suspicion that perhaps not everything was being told. It was noted that the person with whom she was supposed to have committed adultery was none other than the son of Mark Antony. So was there perhaps a political dimension there? It was noted as well that she was supposed to have hawked herself in the shadow of the statue of Marsyas, the satire of Greek myth displayed in life, according to the Italians, escaped and come to Italy and become a symbol of liberty and freedom. So was it possible that again, there was some political dimension to this? Was Julia establishing herself as the champion of the people? And in that light, it's very telling that there was actually a great deal of sympathy for her. Julia was actually very popular. She was very waggy, she was very witty. She, I suppose, was the toast of metrosexual Rome in particular. Whose great spokesman, of course, was the poet Ovid. And it is easy when we read of it, when we think of his influence on subsequent European literature, particularly his influence on people's understanding of Greek mythology, but also of the erotic. He's the great love poet. It's easy to overlook the degree to which his poetry, particularly his erotic poetry, in the context of a city that's criminalised adultery, is highly subversive. Ovid, in a sense, is a samizdat figure. And it's not surprising in that context that a few years on from the ruin of Julia, her daughter, also, and from the point of view of the story very annoyingly, also called Julia, she succumbs to a sex scandal. She, in many ways, was even racier than Mummy. She was said to have she had the largest house in Rome and the smallest dwarf, which I always think is a wonderful pairing. She got dispatched to an island, just as her mother had been. Again, with her, there were rumours of political scheming, and Ovid got caught up in it. He, of course, was sent much further away than Julia. Julia was exiled to an island off the coast of Italy. Ovid was sent all the way to the Black Sea. And his fate, which he histrionically and endlessly cast as the worst possible fate in the world for someone like Ovid to be exiled to the Black Sea, beyond horror. That's the Russell Brand being exiled to Port Stanley. He cast this as something that he was always hinting at, that there was a moral, a political dimension to his fate. In other words, he recognised that immorality in Rome was always highly and intensely political and therefore dangerous. So morality mattered very much to Augustus, and those who were felt to be immoral, no matter how high, no matter how talented, knew in the wake of the sex scandals that embraced the two Julias and Ovid that they ran real risks. And the same was true under the reign of the man who succeeded Augustus, Tiberius. Here he is with money. Livia, if indeed she was poisoning people, very successful. Tiberius did become emperor. And he, like Augustus, was a man of austere morals. In fact, in many ways even more so. Augustus was mildly provincial. He was not born in Rome, he was born outside in a dusty city south of Rome. Tiberius was absolutely in the heart of the establishment, doubly Claudian, the very snootiest dynasty in Rome. And all his life he was pledged to certain fundamentals. He was pledged to the dignity of the Senate, to the ideals of the aristocracy, and to the kind of the rather stiff, turnip-munching virtues of Rome in its earliest years. And many stories were told that illustrated that. Tiberius was a great general. He was probably the greatest general of his era, and in many ways the life that he lived was that of a hero out of the early pages of Livy. So, for instance, while he was campaigning in Pannonia, what's now Hungary, conquering it, winning it for the Roman people, his brother was campaigning beyond the Rhine in Germany. News came to Tiberius that his younger brother had been injured, the horse had supposedly rolled on him. Tiberius gets on his own horse, gallops bravely through enemy territory, gets to his brother, clasps him in his arms as Drusus dies, and then escorts him all the way back to Rome. And the Roman people come out to greet this funeral cortege. Drusus, sort of great populist, Prince Harry of his day, much loved. The Roman people sob and weep at the sight of him dead. Tiberius, his stiff upper lip remains resolutely stiff. He is not going to indulge in emotional theatricals. He is overtly contemptuous of it. And so as a result, the Roman people do not like him. They recognise that his brand of morality is one that regards the enthusiasms and the passions of the people with scorn. And when Tiberius becomes emperor, there is a sense in which it is the triumph of the aristocratic principles, the overtly aristocratic cast of mind that had been a continuum throughout the history of the Republic. And that is very much how Tiberius wishes to rule. He wishes to see himself absolutely in that tradition. But of course, he is also ruling as an emperor, as an autocrat, as the adopted son of Augustus, the heir of an aged despot. And as a result, Tiberius' attempt to cast himself as a man in the grand tradition of all that is best and most moral about the Senate strikes his fellow senators essentially as risible. And it seems that ultimately the strain of this, of his unpopularity with both the people and with the class that he had hoped to identify with and defend the Senate, Tiberius seems to have had enough. He seems to have washed his hands, and that is why ultimately he retires to Capri. Now, he spends the last 10 years of his life on Capri, but he continues to rule in a highly effective way. The frontiers remain stable, the provinces stay well governed relatively, and peace reigns across the Mediterranean. And this is regarded by most provincials with much admiration. There is no equivalent of St. John to skewer Tiberius. Just the opposite. The account by a Jewish writer that we have praises him in the most effusive terms. So Philo, Jew writing in Alexandria, sees Tiberius as a kind of Prospero figure on his island, not just a man who's brought peace to the world, but as Philo says, for wisdom and erudition, there is nobody of his generation to compare. The sense that Tiberius is a man who, he's not just a great ruler, but he has the wisdom to penetrate the doings of the gods themselves. So that seems to be the perspective, certainly of those very few provincial accounts we have, but I think that they are telling. Against that is the perspective from Rome. And in Rome, it tends to be taken for granted that people in the public eye who choose to retire, who choose to draw a veil over what should be a life spent in the public eye, that there can be only one explanation for that, and that is that the man is a monstrous perv. And so as a result, shocking stories are told of what Tiberius gets up to in Capri, and they're so shocking that I certainly can't discuss them here, although they are in my book. Like that. And they have effectively destroyed his reputation. They have besmeared all the many achievements that he wrought in his long, distinguished career. And so it's impossible, I think, to know whether there's any truth to them at all. There is really only one, I think, that has possibly the faint psychological smack of truth. And that is, we are told by both Tacitus and Suetonius, that the one thing Tiberius really enjoyed was to watch erotic tableau. He enjoyed getting people to pose for him. And there are various things that specify about this that are suggested. We're told that these erotic tableaux were invariably mythological in theme. And we've heard from Philo that Tiberius' understanding of the gods was widely known to the divine. In fact, I mean, it would seem that actually Tiberius' life in Capri was actually pretty restrained. His idea of a good evening out was to invite a load of literary critics over, give them some vegetables, and then ask them difficult questions about sort of Greek epic. But it is perhaps telling that we are told that these erotic tableaux, that they were mythological in theme. We're told as well that the people who played the parts in these mythological tableaux, Tacitus says that it was beauty and good bodies, uncorrupted innocence and distinguished ancestry. These were what turned him on. In other words, it's the children of senators who were being brought over and obliged to behave and to work like the most common kind of sex worker. And this might seem a paradox because, of course, that is a betrayal of everything that Tiberius had fought for, this staining of senatorial honour. But you don't have to be Freud to recognise that maybe that's precisely the point. Ovid, who was as astute an analyst of the erotic as anyone who's ever written, and he said, desire is fueled by prohibitions. And so it's just possible that what is going on here is a conscious attempt by, it's the id of Tiberius working against his ego. And even if the stories are not actually true, the fact that they are told about him, I think, reflects this understanding, the ambivalent relationship that Tiberius, by the end of his life, had come to have with the traditions and the customs that he had always sought to uphold throughout his life. Now, there is a further reason, perhaps, for thinking that there might be no smoke without fire in this one case, and that is what happens when Tiberius dies. And he is succeeded by Gaius, better known, of course, as Caligula. Because supposedly Caligula had also participated in these erotic tableaux, both as a producer and as an actor. And the way in which he is described as taking part in this makes it evident two very clear traits in his character. One, physicality, a love of performance, of dressing up, of showing off. Secondly, a pleasure in hurting and humiliating people. And it does seem that when Caligula becomes emperor, he takes those traits to the much broader stage that is Rome. And the humiliation and the love of dressing up that, if the stories are true, had been confined to Capri, when he becomes emperor, are lavished on the political stage. Because Caligula, unlike Augustus, unlike Tiberius, is not interested in the traditional morals of the Roman state. Just the opposite. He has decided, it would seem, that he is going to uphold his autocracy by reveling in it, by revealing the naked foundations that support it. And by doing that, he is going to reach over the heads of the senatorial elite, the traditional arbiters of what is right and proper in Rome, to the people. And he's going to entertain the people with spectacles, with shows, with gladiatorial combats, with chariot races, all the things that Tiberius had scorned. But he's also going to entertain the people by humiliating their betters. And this, I think, is what underlies the most notorious story told about Caligula. He wanted to make his horse a consul. Almost certainly, it's a joke. He's saying this because he is rubbing the noses of the senatorial elite for whom the consulship is the highest, the pinnacle of their career, the thing that they had always hankered after. Caligula is saying to them, it's all in my gift. I can make anyone I want a consul, even my horse if I want. And in that context, and in the context of what he was supposed to have done in Capri, it's intriguing that, in a sense, the most shocking story that is told about Caligula and his determination to humiliate senators is that he took their wives and their children, installed them on the Palatine, obviously as hostages, but again this familiar story crops up that he offered them as prostitutes to anyone who wanted to use them. And the echo there of what was going on in Capri is palpable and intriguing, and it's not one that either Tacitus or Suetonius draws attention to. So it suggests that there are two rival traditions there, both drawing clearly on the same sort of ideological wellsprings. Now, ultimately, Caligula discovered that there were limits set on his autocracy, and that limit was basically set by the unwillingness of big, burly captains in the Praetorian Guard to be laughed at for having a voice like a girl. Caligula made the classic error of mocking the man who had who commanded a large array of swords, and he ended up murdered by his own guards, and was succeeded by his uncle, Claudius. Now, Claudius, it's kind of yin and yang, it's swings and roundabouts. Claudius, in the wake of Caligula's reign, is very keen to get back to the kind of traditional family values that Augustus and Tiberius had upheld. He, of course, had suffered notable disabilities which had prevented him from leading the kind of public life that someone of his rank and status properly should have led, and so he was from his youth reduced to the he took up the humiliating, demeaning career of a historian, and as a result of that, he was very familiar with the traditions and the customs that the Roman state embodied, and he sought to be true to them. But he did have problems, and that was that his blood relationship to Augustus was so minimal as effectively to be non-existent. He had no title to the name Caesar. He had not been adopted by anyone, he did not inherit it by right. And so as a result, it was very, very important to him that he marry someone who did have the blood link to Augustus. And the woman who had the blood link was Messalina. Seen here, you know, this is the image that she wanted to portray. There she has the scholar in her head, just as Livia had, figure of imposing and terrifying potency. So she was recognized by people in Rome that she was a figure of great significance in her own right. Claudius needed her. And the measure of that, perhaps, is that the most shameless toady in Rome, Vitellius, father of the future emperor, who had an absolutely unerring nose for anyone who was powerful, he's supposed to have stolen one of her slippers, keep it in the folds of his toga. And whenever he saw Messalina, he would ostentatiously take it out and kiss it. So that was the mark of how powerful she was, and it gives the sense of the way in which she stalked people's fantasies as well as fears. The fact that a woman should have this power, obviously very unmanning. Roman male did not like the idea that a woman should have power. But in the stories that were told of her, there is the sense, just perhaps, that there were people who found this actually quite exciting. The idea that a woman might have this position of authority. However, Messalina was not the only person on whom Claudius relied. He was unpopular with the Senate because the Senate, in the wake of Caligula's death, had briefly hoped that they might restore the Republic, by which they essentially meant their own authority and power. And the fact that Claudius had spawned the Praetorians, and indeed may well have been in on the plot that saw Caligula murdered, meant that essentially he had come to power in a naked coup. So Claudius was not popular with his own peers, the kind of people that otherwise he would have relied upon for support. And so he turned instead to people he absolutely could rely upon, who were his slaves and his freedmen. And again, it's the measure of how important these freedmen were that even Messalina recognised the need to, as it were, suck up to them. She's meant to have had a fling with one of them and then to have dispatched him, which in a way is a kind of tribute. You know, she's a kind of monster spider chewing people up and then dispatching them. But the very fact that she thought this freedman was worth sleeping with, if the stories are true, implies just how potent the freedmen could be at the court of Claudius if they could get on board with Claudius and win his confidence. And there was one man more than any other who really did win Claudius' confidence, as his name implies, a Greek called Narcissus. And Narcissus was notorious for his hostility to Messalina. Messalina hated him. In the accounts of Claudius' reign, he's seeing placid surface of the imperial court, while underneath it, giant sea monsters are tearing bits out of each other down in the depths, Messalina, Narcissus, until Messalina gets embroiled in the most shocking sex scandal. I mean, even worse than the two Julias. Quite spectacular. What happens is that apparently, so it is said, she gets so consumed by her lusts that she falls head over heels in love with the most handsome man in the Senate, a guy called Gaius, that she marries him, that she's set on dispatching Claudius, that she thinks nothing of her little boy, Britannicus, named after Claudius's greatest feat of conquest, that of Britain, the heir, the person presumably will succeed Claudius. Messalina thinks nothing of that, throws it all away. She is a creature of her desires and her ambitions and her lusts. And of course, when Claudius finds out about it, he is not less pleased, and Messalina ends up dead. Such is the story that was told, such is the story that really set the seal on Messalina's monstrous reputation as an nymphomaniac, as a prostitute, as a terrible, terrible monster. And that is the story that has passed into the present day with Aubrey Beardsley and Graves and Claudius. But when we look at we don't really have contemporary, but sources as near as we can get, even in those, there is a recognition that there is something not quite right with this story. Because people do recognise the improbability that someone as powerful as Messalina, the wife of Caesar, the mother of Caesar's heir, is it really likely that she would have thrown it all away? And in that context, it is, I think, interesting that when you look at the story, the narrative of what is supposed to have happened when she fell, you do spot that it has the fingerprints of Narcissus all over it. So we are told that the story of what Messalina has done, she's married Gaius, is broken to Claudius by two of his concubines, and they are pushed into his presence by Narcissus. Now Claudius at the time was down at Ostia developing a port, again, very British sort of great thing to be doing. He immediately gets in a carriage and starts hurtling back up to Rome. With him are two senators and Narcissus. Claudius asks the two senators, what do you think is going on? And they hum and haw and sort of squirm and don't quite know what to say. Narcissus is the one who says, yep, she's guilty. They pull into Rome. Messalina, we're told, comes out with Britannicus, trying to appeal to Claudius' better nature. It's Narcissus who shouts her down. And when Claudius arrives in Rome, he entrusts the command of the praetorians to Narcissus, and it is Narcissus who takes control of them and who ensures that not just Messalina, but Gaius and everyone who supposedly was involved in the plot is wiped out. And in consequence of that, by the time the corpses have been dragged away, by the time the blood has dried, there is no one left alive who can contradict the narrative that is going to be promoted by Narcissus. Now, that does not mean, of course, that that's the solution. It's the best solution that I can come up with. It's the solution that seems to me to best correspond to the kind of brute realities of the court and the way in which gossip and power had a kind of mutual relationship. But what it does suggest, I think, is that part of the fascination of studying the Julio-Claudians is that it is, in two levels, a detective story. It is, of course, a detective story in the way that all ancient history is a detective story, the marshalling of clues and the fragments of clues to try and form some kind of coherent pattern. But it's also a detective story in the sense that you are constantly looking at seemingly fantastical stories for the hints of dark and conspiratorial motives. And it's that strain that I think adds to the fascination of this remarkable period. The stories in themselves are shocking, fascinating. They have gripped the imagination for 2,000 years. But the ultimate fascination is to recognise that actually they do offer us, I think, a way into understanding not just the heartbeat of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, but also how the Roman people themselves saw the Julio-Claudian dynasty and also saw themselves. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. As I said at the outset, a sharp gift for narrative combined with a precise eye for divergent traditions and for the hints and clues within sources which lead us to the deeper realities. Lots of exciting things to discuss. Everything from disastrous dinners to slippers. Everything could come into play. I want to kick off just asking a question about one of the things that has always intrigued me about the emperors, particularly about the emperors that were tapped in retrospect by the historians. Many of the emperors are deified. Many of the emperors and their consorts and their children live in a world that's actually close to divinity. The world of the god is exampled, for instance, by the shocking satire of Claudius's pumpkinification, where the gods actually rebel against the enforcement of this idiot into their councils. But the gods are by no means blameless themselves when it comes to their morality. The sources, Ovid and the rest, are awash with the stories of the infidelities of the deities. And I just wondered whether part of the problem and attraction of aristocratic life, and it's kind of as it's portrayed, is that these poor figures have in some way to be so large in life, to almost be assimilated, both in a literary sense, but also in the imagination of the people, to gods and to the excess. The excess is forced upon them.
Yes, well, Claudius is mocked by Seneca, but Claudius has to become a god because it means that his adopted son and heir then ranks as Deiphilius, son of a god, and that person, of course, is Nero. Nero has taken on the family name of Claudius. And he is the son of Agrippina, who, like Messalina, is a blood descendant of Augustus. And the fact that incest is absolutely a crime in Rome, it's regarded as a particularly heinous one. So the fact that Claudius has to go to the degree of forcing legislation through the Senate that enables him to marry his niece, and he gets Vitellius again to do it, the seasoned crawler. It demonstrates just how vital it is for Claudius to have in his bed someone who has the blood of Augustus. Now, Augustus, of course, is the original Deiphilius. He is the original son of God because he is the adopted son of Julius Caesar. And the deification of Julius Caesar ensures that the young Caesar has not only his name but this hint of the divine about him. Now, he has to learn how to play with this. There is a scandalous episode shortly after the Battle of Philippi, when he and Antony wipe out the Republican armies, where he is supposed to have taken on the role of Apollo at a dinner party. And the news of this is so shocking because it's sort of in a period of austerity, so it provokes fury on the streets of Rome. And the young Caesar is forced to recognise that playing up too unsubtly to this divine role will get him into all kinds of trouble, as of course we've got Caesar into trouble. So the genius that he then displays over the course of his career is knowing just how to go just far enough. So Augustus, his name Augustus, it hints at the divine without actually saying I am divine. And he's so successful at that when he dies and he becomes a god, there is no one who doubts his right to be a god. So even in Seneca's mockery of Claudius, Augustus is up in Olympus, and it's unquestioned that he has the right to be there. Now the consequence of that is that the shadow of Augustus hangs over everyone who follows him. There is an account in Tacitus of Tiberius standing before the cult statue of Augustus that gets interrupted by Agrippina the elder, which does imply how literally someone like Tiberius did regard himself as being in the shadow of this godlike, God figure, this divine figure. And from that, really, one of the thing that really gives to this dynasty more than to any other is the sense that there really is something, really is a supernatural quality to his blood in the veins. And that again, I think, does much to explain why the women in particular almost invariably come to horrible ends. Because, of course, if you're a woman and you have the blood of Augustus in your veins, then you offer someone who is not the family of Augustus the chance to mingle your blood with Augustus's blood and to produce a child who will then have a chance of, as it were, having a stab at the empire. So in a sense, the most precious thing, almost in the Roman Empire, is the womb of a woman who is descended from Augustus. And in that light, it's not surprising, really, that so many of them end up exiled, destroyed, ruined, the victims of slander, of murder, of execution. Nor, of course, is it surprising that so many of the male descendants of Augustus likewise end up brutally dispatched. And the measure of the bloodbath, the Game of Thrones, if you like, that it initiates, is that by the time Nero is cornered and orders his throat to be cut, with his death, the last of the lineal descendants of Augustus is dead. None of them, there is no one left. That in fact, the dynasty of Augustus is gone. And of course, from that point on, there will be more emperors, and some of those emperors will become gods. And Vespasian, who succeeded after the era before emperors, succeeds to the position that Augustus and Julio-Claudian took held, famously says as he died, Never said, "Oh, I think I'm becoming a god." It's a joke, because everyone knows he's not really becoming a god. And the emperors that followed Vespasian, likewise, they are the heads of the empire, but they do not have this kind of terrifyingly sacral quality that people with the bloodline of Augustus had, and which rendered particularly someone like Caligula and Nero so incredibly potent.
Just a call out to Nerva, a good emperor still bearing himself on Augustus. Yes, questions? Other observations, scandalous stories that you wish to tell?
I've cancelled one appointment in order to listen to this to the end, so I do thank you. You mentioned metrosexuals. I wondered which of the candidates, which of the characters you described might be described as a hipster.
Well, I suppose hipsters didn't really kick in Rome until Hadrian, who was the first one to go in. They all stay resolutely clean shaven. Although I suppose actually Nero sort of experiments with facial hair. He gets kind of Elvis style sideboards, but that's not really a hipster, is it? I think Ovid is, the fascination of Ovid is that he is playing with elements within a great metropolis that appeal. It's the reason why people, Ovid is from out of town. He goes to Rome, he becomes the most fashionable poet in the city, he writes about how to have affairs, about what you should do, about how you should dress, about how you should decorate, all these kind of things. He's very into all that. He's absolutely expressive of the way in which, in a great metropolis, there will be people who are hip, who are cool, who are hipsters, who are whatever. But his fate also demonstrates that people hate hipsters. By being cool, by being hip, Ovid infuriates some very powerful people. And in a sense, what happens to him is the kind of fate that I think quite a lot of us would like to wish on hipsters. Back to the most boring place imaginable. Make them live there at the end of their day, with no barbers, no lumberjack shirts, no bros. So I would nominate Ovid as the proto-hipster.
In another age, you would have written hexasyllables on different coffee.
Yes, you would be a fat white man.
Right, other questions? Other challenges? Yes. Yes.
Since we're tying in with contemporary culture, it struck me with the statue of Caligula. The strong similarity to King Joffrey from Game of Thrones. I can't wonder whether that's coincidental or not.
Yes, there is. There's actually, if you Google Joffrey and Caligula, there's a whole internet meme comparing the actor who plays Joffrey in Game of Thrones with Caligula, and the resemblance is really very striking. And the actor who played Joffrey, I think, did classics in Dublin, I think. Whether that was deliberate or not, I don't know. But it's clear that one of the ways in which this narrative perpetuates itself is absolutely through popular culture. So Claudius was absolutely decisive in forging the fashion for epic family dramas. And in many ways, when it was screened in America, it was held to be too shocking. So there's in the BBC version, Caligula sleeps with Drusilla, his sister, and gets her pregnant, and then slices open her stomach and eats the fetus. And this was cut from the American version. It was felt to be too shocking. But it had a huge impact on American TV makers and the people who made Dynasty, which obviously I'm kind of paying homage to in the title of my book, consciously sought to write a Julio-Claudian epic set in contemporary America. And that in turn strongly influenced, for instance, The Sopranos. Tony Soprano, his mother is called Livia. It's not a coincidence. There is an extraordinary scene in the first season of The Sopranos where Tony Soprano sits at a baseball match and talks to his uncle about Augustus. He was a man who loved his people. They loved him. It's all about Augustus as the ideal mafia boss. And of course that has then bled into Game of Thrones, obviously, and the Kevin Spacey ones, House of Cards. I mean, so I think that wherever there is some dynastic family epic in which people are doing unspeakable things to one another, I think the Julio-Claudian narrative lurks in the background of it.
Well, we've actually had an election. Yes.
When you mentioned the notion of the sacred blood of Augustus, did it literally die out again? Or was there some sort of common political decision in Rome that you don't want any more of these as too dangerous? Because there don't seem to be any pretenders popping up on this.
Well, actually, there are. When Nero dies, you would think from Tacitus and you would think from the biblical tradition that everyone would just be delighted to see the back of him, that this is a monster. In fact, he seems to be widely mourned. Flowers were laid on his tomb for decades after, and particularly in the East, people were always popping up claiming to be Nero. There were any number of false Neros. And the most astonishing tribute, really, that is paid to the charisma of Nero is that in the Talmud he is enshrined as someone who became a Jew. And I think he's the great-grandfather of one of the key rabbinical figures in the Babylonian Talmud. So clearly, the Christian tradition is completely negative. The Jewish tradition is much more positive. And it does seem that, particularly in the East, people really got what Nero was about. I mean, basically Nero was casting himself as the equivalent of a hero from a Greek tragedy, which I think is one of the reasons why he killed his mother. I mean, obviously the political reasons why he wanted to kill his mother. She was the daughter of Germanicus. She had a hold over the Praetorians in the army, which made her politically dangerous. She was clearly a tremendous man, and Nero didn't have a problem with that. I think there's probably a part that she just wanted to know what's it like to kill your mother. He was a glutton for new experiences. But also, I think he wanted to kill her because that's the kind of thing that heroes in Greek tragedies and gods do. And when he goes to Greece and he acts, shocking thing for any Roman, let alone an emperor, to do, he takes on the role of Orestes, who, the whole point of Orestes, these tragic heroes, that he killed his mother, and then you have Nero who killed his mother playing the role of Orestes. It's not as if he's exactly trying to hide it. Just the opposite, he's trying to draw attention to it. And it seems to have worked. And so Nero is commemorated as this kind of culture hero in the East, by Jews, by Greeks. He was horrible, but very cool.
Well, with that, yes, one last question.
Just in relation to Julio-Claudian women in this era, can you let any light on whether it is the case that the wife of Pontius Pilate belonged to the Julio-Claudians, the one who had the dreams and urged Pontius Pilate to have nothing to do with anything concerning Christ? I've heard it in various sources that she was supposed to have been a part of the imperial family. Is there any truth in that?
Well, what we know about Pontius Pilate, we know from Josephus that he was a fairly brutal figure. What else we know about him? Obviously, the primary sources are the Gospels, but they are problematic as history because, in a sense, they are being written for a Roman audience, and so the scene where Pilate washes his hands, in essence, as an attempt to try and wash the Roman imperial state of responsibility for the crucifixion of Jesus. So it's difficult to be certain, really, of anything about Pilate beyond the fact that he was a rather brutal figure, and that presumably he was the man responsible for having Jesus executed. And I don't think that Jesus would have been executed unless Pilate had genuinely thought that he was a threat to the Roman state. Having said that, Pilate does seem to have crucified a lot of people. There's a famous short story, I think it's Anatole France, if it's not, correct me in the audience, where it consists of Pilate talking in his retirement with a friend, and it goes on for something like 40 pages, and he's reminiscing. And in the last paragraph they say, his friend says, there's some bloke, Jesus, have you ever come across him? And Pilate sort of frowns. No, it doesn't ring a bell. That's the end of the story. And the thing is, the point is that to subsequent, to Christians, the role that Pilate plays is absolutely key. Pilate is famously the only human figure to be named in the Nicene Creed. But to Pilate himself, what he did was nothing, and he would recognise that there was any significance to it, I don't think. But inevitably, the desire to try and understand what was going on, what Pilate might have been about, bred all kinds of Christian myths and stories and narratives, and there's a wonderful book written by Anne Rowe, which is all about Pilate, but it's about his afterlife. It's about the stories that are told about him, and I think that they are not historical, but they have the kind of truth that myth tends to have, because they are essentially meditations on the role of imperial power, and that is in essence what Pilate has come to represent. He is the figure who upholds Roman authority, and so the understanding of him in subsequent stories depends on the author's attitude to that authority, whether they are sympathetic to him or whether they are hostile to him.
Well, we've had a wonderful evening this evening, which caps off brilliantly a tremendous semester or term of events. We started with Lord Stern, Nicholas Stern, just returned from the Climate Change Conference, COP21. Next to Wolfgang Buttress, now the award-winning, prize-winning architect of the British Pavilion at Milan Expo. We've carried on through a whole range of highlights, including Lloyd Grossman talking about Benjamin West, topics as diverse as the Baroque, the classical and the modern. We were thrilled last night by Chris Stevens' presentation, who is stunning Henry Moore's show in the Vase of Diocletian, and we triumphantly end with a lesson on how it is not a good idea to imitate the classics, but a very good idea to learn from them. Tom, thank you so much for bringing us. We would like to invite everybody to join us for a drink in the foyer, just recently reclaimed from the stacks that were sitting there as we refurbished our lively basement. Another triumphant conclusion of the year. Come and join us for a drink to celebrate the end of the year. And if I don't get the chance to say it on any other occasion, all our best wishes from the British School Road to all of you as we bring this year to a close. Merry Christmas to everyone.